Right, YouTube, this is Robert Ness 816 and we're making another Game Gear video. So I already made one about recapping Game Gear, so this is just a follow-up here with a blue one because I always thought that these were kind of neat. Um, so yeah, this is pretty much there's nothing special about these Game Gears other than the fact that they are blue. Other than that, they're basically identical to any other Game Gear that you would find from this era. So they are mostly going to be VA1 single ASIC Game Gears, which is the most common revision of the Game Gear that you'll find under most circumstances. Um, so between all the revisions, I actually kind of like this one the best because it's basically the most common. Um, and it works good. I mean, there's you can find like newer ones like VA5 Game Gears, yada yada yada, and whatever. I have two of them. They're not really anything special. These are good because they're common. I know they work just as good. So capacitors though, every Game Gear needs capacitors. I don't care if it still works or if it's like this one and you're like, oh, maybe it doesn't need capacitors. Maybe they're just maybe it just needs to be cleaned. No, every Game Gear needs capacitors. So if I can zoom in here with this, I'm not sure if I can do that actually. Oh, there you go. You can see the feet on the Game Gear there by C54, how corroded they are. So like every other Game Gear in existence, this one has leaking capacitors. So we're going to go ahead and change all of them out. Um, that's something that is just going to need to be changed, cleaned, inspected just to make sure that nothing else is leaking. And usually what I find with these is that, 9 times out of 10, the capacitors over here are usually okay with the exception of that one by the fluorescent tube there. The capacitor here is a 10 microfarad, but it's going to be next to this here, which is labeled fluorescent. So these leak sometimes. Over here, we can get back over on this side. These two always leak all the time. These two leak. These two usually leak. This one leaks. So pretty much all of these on this side of the Game Gear, they leak. And yeah, this one leaks too. I mean, it's a mess. Looking at the power board, these usually don't go bad because they're your regular through-hole type electrolytic capacitors. So these are usually pretty good. I don't know why Sega didn't use those throughout the entire PCB. And then these surface mounts here, these always leak too. So yeah, we're gonna go ahead and change out every capacitor on this system. So the kit that I'm using is again from Console 5. And yeah, they use mostly, I think, Panasonic capacitors, which there is absolutely nothing wrong with. Panasonic makes fantastic capacitors. Everybody talks about Rubicon and Nichicon, all those other manufacturers. They're fine too. Panasonic, you know what? Hey, they make good stuff. So, um, yeah. So symptoms that you need capacitors. When you turn on the Game Gear with a game inserted, you're just going to get lines on the screen, vertical or horizontal lines, and they'll probably change, and you might get a very faded picture. Sometimes the sound will work, or sometimes it'll be faded, sometimes it won't work. Usually that's a sign that the capacitors are bad because the capacitors in a Game Gear are used as bridging capacitors, or coupling capacitors rather, and when they go bad, electricity can't flow through them as efficiently, so the system is working, but it can't process any information to the screen or to the speaker because that's being hampered by the fact that these shitty capacitors and these things are leaking. Happens all the time. It's Game Gear in, look at that, I've been zoomed in this whole time. It's the Game Gear in 2016, and it's probably been like that for probably 10 years now. So anyways, let's get into repairing this thing. Alright, so something I wanted to show you guys is it's very important to break the glue free on these capacitors before you go ahead and try to remove them. That prevents the cases here from breaking, so you're just going to grab your needle nose pliers and just kind of twist a little bit and the glue should break. So what I'm doing is just bending them up slightly just so I have room here to desolder them. These capacitors here, if I can zoom in on them, hopefully I'll remember to fix that. These capacitors right here are going to pose a little bit of an issue as far as desoldering them, because once the electrolyte leaks, it really kind of forms like a barrier of some type on the solder. And also I found that it kind of burns the traces and the pads a little bit if you try to unsolder these caps without removing the electrolyte. So what I'm going to do is actually take some rubbing alcohol and a cotton swab and try to clean that off as best I can. Alright, so I'm not really too sure how well you can see that, but that green crap on the Q-tip is actually electrolyte, and that is enough to prevent solder from actually flowing onto or off of these capacitors here. So always clean these things up as best you can before you decide to try to solder onto them. Okay, so as you can see, this one area does get a little bit tricky because you have to watch out for the button post there by R39. So you have to get a little creative with how you put your capacitors down. So really happy with how this came out. So I just got to clean off the flux here from the capacitor here by R42. So that's really it. Just one little area I figured I'd show you guys because this does get a little bit tricky right here. Okay, so the main board has been completely recapped. It is good to go now. This job actually went pretty well. Yeah, I mean, I really have no complaints about it. I've had Game Gears that were in much, much worse condition that really were honestly not even worth saving, but I fixed them and I got them going again. But yeah, this one's actually a really nice example. The only caps that were leaking were these two here, this one, and I believe the 100 microfarad up here, which was kind of a pain. But other than that, it was pretty easy. And over here, all these went on pretty easily too. So now on to the soundboard and the power board. All right, so the soundboard has been cleaned up, tinned, and the old caps have been removed. So this is actually kind of rare for a Game Gear because usually these capacitors, they just leak all over the place and destroy the pads and traces on these soundboards. But this one, not even a drop of electrolyte, which is actually pretty impressive. So there's all of the old capacitors there so far. Very dry, which is surprising, and they came off pretty easily. So I usually just take my needle nose pliers and twist them right off, and there you go. So putting on the new capacitors is going to be a bit challenging, and you have to get a little crafty with the soundboard because you're basically putting this in a very confined space, and it also has to have an RF shield placed on top of it. So let's see what the finished product looks like. Alright, so this particular soundboard came out really good. Again, that's in part to the fact that the capacitors did not leak. But yeah, I'm very happy with how the legs came out on this particular one. Very clean looking, and yeah, it should have no problems fitting under the RF shield. This is why you always change all of the capacitors on a Game Gear or anything that has known issues with leaking caps. So if you can see that black gunk there, that is actually electrolyte that has leaked out of the bottom of this capacitor, and pretty nasty stuff. So the capacitor actually does have some residue on the bottom of it there, and it's pretty gross. Sticking to my hands actually, so definitely something that will need to be replaced, and luckily for me I have the very last capacitor to put into this Game Gear, and then we can test it out. Before I button this thing up here, I figured I'd just show you the through holes there where the leaking capacitor was. So my camera has a lot of trouble, or my cell phone actually has a lot of trouble exposing properly for some reason, but so you can see that the the through holes there have tarnish on them and corrosion. So I've done my best to clean them off, and they test fine with a multimeter, so they have continuity going through them and stuff, so they're fine, but you know, just a good reason to replace all of the capacitors on one of these consoles. Alright, so now comes the fun part. So, not shown was when I removed the main board, cleaned up the button contacts, and cleaned off the screen. Nobody likes having dirt behind the screen. So, we're gonna put the power on. I have it plugged into an AC power source. These use the MK2103 power supply. So, a pretty common power supply to find. So we'll flip the switch, and there you go. How's the sound? Does it work? We'll find. Oh, there you go. Does it go louder? There you go. Ooh, that's loud. Contrast looks good. A pretty broad adjustment range, which is actually great. That usually is a good indication that the console is actually in good shape. So your task will be wicked. Oh boy. Battery on my phone's about to die. So we'll just test out the direction. So that works. And there you go. Good. Let me see, does the up direction work? That's, I should be able to throw things up. Can't do that two-handed. Oh, yes, I can one-handed. Here we go. Nice. Good, so this Game Gear is perfect. I'm actually going to polish up the screen cover, because you can actually do that with the Game Gear. So let's, I'll let this actually run for about an hour because I want to make sure it's perfectly fine. The reason why is that if anything is about to go bad on this, it'll basically show up within the first couple hours of operation. So basically I'm just going to let this thing run in demo mode so I can turn this off and then turn it back on again, and basically just let this thing run through its demo mode. So that's really it, guys. This Game Gear is back to its original condition, and it works again. So thanks for watching.